So we'll go ahead and record it for Cindy in case she'd like to view it. Okay, so my understanding of Genesis is this is the actual account of what God did. He did it in this way. Okay, however, even if I wasn't convinced of that, I would still choose to interpret it that way through that lens. Why? Because Genesis was written so that I could understand what God did and how I'm supposed to relate to him. So when I look at this, when I look at the book of Genesis, I need to take it seriously, not allegorize it. Otherwise, I'm not even going to be able to understand the New Testament, because Genesis 1 is the first layer of cement on the foundation of the whole rest of what the Bible is built upon. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is this making sense? So, and I want to, but again, I want to put that out there. I think it's a mistake to make a literal understanding of Genesis a litmus test for the authenticity of someone's Christian faith, because I know a lot of people that are very scientifically minded that just wrestle with this when they look at the evidence around that science has produced. I would just suggest be careful letting so-called modern scientific understanding trump the ancient historic understanding of what God did, for a couple of reasons. One, modern science is produced by scientists, and people are often agendaed. So be careful, just because they're using the scientific method or whatever, these are things that can't be tested properly in a laboratory. So that whole field of study of evolutionary biology, I listen to some podcasts regularly from evolutionary biologists, and I'm stunned at how much insight they give to the human animal, to how we think and what we do. I'm stunned by it. And in fact, it makes me all the more sympathetic to those who would say, gosh, I just think that God must have used evolution, and then they allegorize it. So it's like, oh, he created the heavens and the earth. Oh, okay, so he set it into motion, and then it took billions of years. It wasn't a literal day. Now I'm going to struggle with that, because the word for day in the Old Testament is the Hebrew word yom, which, what yom means? 24 hours. It's the same exact, that's what it means. It literally means a day. So could it be an epoch or a period? Yeah, it could be, perhaps. Or here's another one. This is a more obscure theory, something that I kind of like, because I like obscure things, because I'm an obscurantist. And there's a theory called the gap theory that says maybe, this was put forth by C.I. Schofield in the early 1900s in his Schofield Study Bible. He said, perhaps God made all of this, but then it was millions of years later before he created man. And so that's why the earth has this appearance of age. Well, Answers in Genesis puts out material to say, wait a second, you can account for a lot of what you see in the world if you just take a literal view of Noah's flood, having covered the whole earth. And then like Ken Ham's famous line is, you need, for the Grand Canyon, you need a little water and a lot of time, or a whole lot of water and a little time, and you can create the Grand Canyon. It's like, okay. So I think the jury is somewhat out as to, can we necessarily account for everything Genesis says from an archaeological, scientific standpoint. But I would say this, and you could take a look, a great resource for this is the Thompson Chain Reference Study Bible. In the back, among its great tools, is an archaeological supplement that was put in like 1984 or something into the Thompson Chain Reference Study Bible. And it's fascinating. So here's an important note. You can't prove everything in Genesis and Exodus archaeologically, but nothing which has been discovered archaeologically has ever done anything other than to confirm it. You understand what I'm saying? So you can't prove all of it archaeologically, but nothing that is archaeological has ever disproved the biblical record. So it's like, so that's important too. The thing I just always want to make clear, whether preaching or teaching or talking about this, is, if I got a guy sitting over here who says, look, I don't know, I think that God must have used ages and epochs, and the Genesis account is probably just referring, it's probably referring to these huge amounts of period, not literal days. It's like, okay, what did you do with Jesus though? Do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? And it's like, yes. Okay, fine. I just want to persuade that guy to take a more serious view of the Old Testament. Or somebody who says, well, look, I don't think Moses was writing with the intention of giving us science. Okay, that's a fair observation, because surely he wasn't, right? Moses wasn't a botanist or an archaeologist, right? He was telling the account as it had been passed down through oral tradition as to what occurred. And this would have no doubt come right from Adam, right? And right from their direct descendants. And because of that, I want to take it very seriously. Personally, I think this is exactly how it happened, but I'm not going to split hairs over it. But again, and why the primary reason? Because then when I read, as we're going to see, when I read the theology present in Genesis, it is very useful because all of the writers that write after Genesis, they treat Genesis like it really happened that way. You understand? So just for literary consistency of the Bible, you're going to have to understand it from that perspective. Yeah, go ahead.
Where I'm at, right off of that, is dealing with, I kind of like to make the analogy. I have no problem moving on with what you said about the six days. And none of that. But it's mankind.
Yeah.
And what I look at is that he created us our own image. And I'm going to make something like an analogy of something in the 20th century. He created a computer. There's a whole room full of a bunch of computers. And we have this, he's really pissed off because of all the sin. We got a computer program product. We got a glitch. There's something clicking along that's not running. He decides to take the whole rooms of the computer and just trash them and throw them and destroy them. He takes the best computer that was in the room and he's got.
So you're talking about like the flood.
The flood.
Yeah, right.
The flood.
Yeah.
The flood is now done.
Yeah.
So now we got one computer. And we still got this flaw called sin.
Right.
And what the whole Bible is almost is like a continuation of the computer program trying to fix the stupid program.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's what it's, to me, where I make that analogy is that, and so all of these fixes that you've got, like you get all these things that are constantly going on from well, you have Apple, now 14.1.
Right.
We've had 50, 60 different ones before that, I mean.
Yeah. Well,
and so each of those represent the maybe key figures in the Bible. Could have been Jeremiah, could have been, any Isaiah, the whole bit.
Well, and that idea fits well with this idea that the Bible, or let's say biblical history, is the unfolding progressive revelation of God. Exactly that, as he's working out the sin problem, little by little revealing Christ, right? And so then, like when we look at Genesis, this totally revolutionized my understanding of both baptism and of the flood. When I was reading, I don't remember who, maybe one of the Puritans, maybe one of the church fathers, somebody that I, up late one night till 4 a.m. reading old dead guys. And I was reading, and somebody, I don't remember who, it could have been Charles Spurgeon, I'm not positive. And they said, look, when we look at baptism, we see through the instrument of the church, because of the grace of God in Jesus, we see the symbolic washing away of all of one person's sin. Just as God did in the flood in Noah's day, he rid the world of sin all at once in order to begin a new chapter in the human history as he's unfolding himself, a little at a time. If you think of humanity like a child, well, the earth, right, fresh from the garden, it's like, that was like the toddler stages of humanity. And then God gives us the law, version 2.0, right? And then it's like, and then the prophets come in 2.7, 3.1 to start to give us even further understanding. And so God is revealing himself a little at a time. But all of that on the foundation of Genesis. Here, listen to this. This is, and you can't go to a more literal, this guy right here, Henry Morris, this is the guy whose work led to the ministry called Answers in Genesis, where they like really try to, they use archaeology, science, like legitimate, like my biology professor from Liberty University was, at least then years ago, connected to some of the people connected to AIG. And he's the guy who I always quote, who used to say he was most worshipful behind the microscope, because it was there that he saw the complexity of life. And he's like, there's no way this came to be by accident. And he was a guy who was an atheist, a devout atheist, when he was studying biology at like Cornell or something. And it was there that his parents' faith finally made sense to him. And he's like, oh, wait a second. Somebody had to design this. This is too complex. There's no way. It holds what we'll talk about it later when we talk about creation. Biological life holds something that creation scientists call irreducible complexity. So when you look at evolution and you say, oh, well, this just kind of, by accident came to be. Well, the trouble with that is much of biological life, if you pull out just one little RNA strand, doesn't work. And it's like, oh, okay. So that's where that was, anyway. So listen to this. This is from Henry Morris, who, again, this is like the most, literal understanding of Genesis. This is my favorite commentary on it, although I do use some others that are not literal at all. The book of Genesis, he writes, is probably the most important book ever written. The Bible as a whole would surely be considered, even by those who don't believe it as in its inspiration, as the book that has exerted the greatest influence on history of any book ever produced. The Bible, however, is actually a compilation of books, and the book of Genesis is the foundation of all of them. If the Bible were somehow expurgated, it was somehow purged of the book of Genesis, as many people today would prefer, he writes, the rest of the Bible would be incomprehensible. It would be like a building without a ground floor or a bridge with no support. The books of the Old Testament narrating God's dealing with the people of Israel would be provincial and bigoted, were they not set in the context of God's developing purposes for all mankind, as laid down in the early chapters of Genesis. The New Testament, describing the execution and implementation of God's plan for redemption, is redundant, except in the light of man's desperate need for salvation, as established in the records of man's primeval history, recorded only in the book of Genesis. So again, I need to read Genesis as an actual account of what happened in order to make sense of what God did. And I'm convinced that then even, let's say, reading backwards from the resurrection, it's like, oh, okay, Jesus believed this is what God did. Jesus proved himself to be God. I ought to probably go ahead and accept what Genesis says. And then I'll figure out where it falls, on the spectrum of science and so on. Okay, so here's what I want to do. Let's go through. Okay, you have that first handout. I would encourage you to look at that. You can look at that on your own. One of the things that's most beneficial there is the outline to get an idea. You see how the whole of the book of Genesis is composed. But today I want to read through Genesis chapter 1 together, and then use these discussion questions to start to really think through some things. Also, some of these discussion questions are going to give me some information to help know if there's anything in particular I ought to be researching specifically to make sure that we flesh it out in these studies a little bit. So if you want to take that with you today, take a look at that. Like that opening outline gives you a good idea to start to orient yourself to the contents of Genesis. So let's start to read it. Let's read. And I'll start, and then anybody who would like to read after that. So I'll read Genesis 1, verses 1 through, I'll read 1 to 5. And so and then we'll go all the way to Genesis like 2:2, because that ends the 7 days of creation. So let's just read the creation account as we get started, and then we'll have a little discussion from these discussion questions, and then see where we go from there. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And as we go through, like even just that one verse, there's like 7 ideas we should unpack. So as we go through, we'll look closer at those things. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And you say, wait a second, he hasn't even made water yet. So in that phrase, I have to say this before we go on, because I love this. It's so beautiful. That the underlying Hebrew word there, in ancient cultures, people referred to the waters. They used a word called, that we would translate more literally, chaos. So imagine like flooding waters, the ocean of primordial abyss. Like that would be a better translation, but that's too many words. The ocean of primordial abyss. It's like God is hovering over the face of the nothingness. And this is a common thought in other, anyway, we'll get into that later, but that's what the waters is. It's not water. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And now would somebody read, let's say, verses 6 through 13?
I'll be glad to do it. If you can hear me, let me know.
We can hear you well, Bruce. Go right ahead.
Okay. And God said, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day.
Excellent. Someone want to read, like, say, from 14 to 19? Yes, ma'am.
And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky and to separate, there was something on the page, to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day.
Amen. Someone want to read, say, 20 to 26? Okay.
And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the sea, and let birds multiply in the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kind. And so, and God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God said, it was good.
You want to read 26?
Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. The God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
Awesome. Somebody want to finish from verse 28 to 31?
God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over everything, every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant in the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has food with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has breath of life in it. I give you green plant for food, and it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day.
Excellent. So chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Somebody want to read it? Or I'll, yeah, go ahead.
King James,
Okay.
thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day. from all his work which he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. This is the history of the heavens and the earth. And they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, before any plant of the field in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. But in the mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being.
Amen. So there are a ton of things already present in just reading this. The key verse, according to this Bible study, I think it's right on point, is Genesis 1:28. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over everything that moves on the earth. That's Genesis 1:28. So a little bit of background. With the other books of the Pentateuch, that is the first 5 books, that just means pent, means 5. It's the first 5 books. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis has been ascribed authorship from Moses. That's the most common understanding of who wrote it. That's the ancient Jewish understanding. The early church understood it that way. The reformers understood it that way, right up to the present day. Modern biblical scholarship, for the most part, assumes Mosaic authorship for Genesis, which certainly means by the time Moses comes on the scene, this would have been oral tradition, as much of the Old Testament was, and then Moses pens it and he puts it down consistent with, he didn't make it up. He would have been putting down what was something like common understanding.
Well, Chris, doesn't this also explain why there could be, for instance, like the dinosaurs and things like that roamed the earth millions of years ago?
Yeah.
Like we were on this day, he said,
Yeah.
that he formed man, which was based on the genealogy we're talking. It's about 3,500 or 4,000 years ago.
Yeah, on the long end, if you take the biblical genealogies and you look at it very carefully, on the long end, you're talking about it accounting for something like 3,500 to maybe 6,000 years. There's a scholar in the Middle Ages who famously did the math on everything you could find in the Bible, and yeah, it's like 6,000 would be the most you could account for, but it's probably less than that. If yeah. And so there have been people who take part of the things we should look at while we're studying this. I can bring in a few of the specific theories, like Schofield's gap theory. Like, it satisfies my mind, because I think, okay, maybe the Genesis account, when God is hovering over the face of the deep, the chaos, is really talking about a sort of recreation of something he'd already created. Almost like he scrapped the first project. But very few people really buy into Schofield's account. But it's like maybe in the beginning there's huge epics of time that are being described, and then Moses. If you read, like when you read Genesis 1, and we'll look at it even more next week, some of the details of the text. If you read Genesis 1, you do get the distinct idea that the point here is to not miss the point that God did this in 2 ways: with purpose, right, and with a certain level of intentionality when it comes to man. So that seems to be the primary message. So even if those days are taken as epics, which they do, it does. I mean, there is a camp of Christianity that really does, can kind of line up modern scientific understandings in a way that makes sense. Like even the order of the Genesis creation, sort of matches the Darwinian understanding of how the things evolved. Now, the trouble with that is, it's like, okay, unless God was supernaturally trying to tell us that that's what happened, Moses wouldn't have thought that. So it's probably, again, better to read it just as don't miss the point of the point. The point is God made man for relationship. He made him intentionally. And Moses isn't trying probably to tell us to record history here as much as, it's like theological history. It's like the difference between a husband and wife telling their kids the date of their marriage and telling them the facts of their courtship, right? Like this is something like that. Like, you know, the Genesis account is the you know, how God did what he did. And we probably should understand. Yeah, because there are, look, I mean, you know, there really are dinosaur bones. It's like, you're gonna have to deal with that, you know. And now, like, again, like the most you know, historical way to view Genesis. Someday we plan to go to the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum they have in it's in Tennessee or something, right? Kentucky. And so at the Creation Museum, you know, some people make fun of it because they have displays where they believe that when the flood happened, there are dinosaurs walking around, and people would have seen them. And interestingly enough, if you take a look at what their scientists say, you know, how many dinosaur bones are there really? If you're not careful, you might be led to believe there's one under every tree in every part. They're not. There actually aren't that many dinosaur bones. They're not found in this super abundance. Now, of course, you could account for that because of time and erosion, and they've drifted away. Okay, maybe. But also, most of the dinosaur bones that are found in places like Utah, New Mexico, you know, other parts of the world where they're common. The Southwest is where they find a lot of them. They're laid down as though they all died all at once, and oftentimes they're encased in sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock forms when water is present. So the Answers in Genesis perspective is right. You would expect that with an actual literal global flood. It explains a lot of this. And they have good scientists like PhDs from MIT. I mean, this is not like hokey, you know, don't let the fact that their museum is in Kentucky fool you if you're partial to making fun of Kentucky. And, you know, so that's their contention. Whereas others say, that's nonsense, because they presuppose that the Darwinian picture of billions of years and hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary data, you know. But anyway, there's a lot that can be unpacked there, because then they also say, okay, if that happened, there's a problem with that theologically. If that's what God did, if God used evolution, there is one major problem with that, is this idea. Then God allowed over millions of years a horrible amount of suffering and pain and death in order to bring about the human race. Whereas this picture, don't you notice when you read Genesis 1 that it kind of reads like poetry? It's gorgeous, it's beautiful. And in the Hebrew, I'm no Hebrew scholar, but in Hebrew, if you take the time to dig through it with the tools, it is a beautiful account. It reads like poetry. Here's what God did, and it was good, and it was good, and it's beautiful. And then it's, you know, sin and rebellion that mars it. And it's even after that, still beautiful, because it was so intensely, richly good in the beginning. So yeah, for sure. So the book of Genesis, if you take a look at that outline, and I encourage you to do it more later, we you know, we'll have to go a little, we can't go into it too deeply, but if you take a look at the outline, just to give a simple idea, chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis give us creation. And then what does it give us right away, right? We're people, we know that this shouldn't surprise us. Right away, humanity falls into sin. Then the downward spiral of sin in the world. That's from chapter 4 through the end of chapter 11. And then from chapter 11 to chapter 50, we see the history of the patriarchs, Abraham and the covenant, Abraham and obedience, and then from Abraham to Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob and Esau, and then Joseph, and then more of Joseph, and then the blessing of Jacob, where his name is, of course, changed to Israel. And so here's a few questions to go through for the remainder of our time together. And here's question number 1. And you have it in that outline. The way I printed it out, I don't know if it's terribly clear that it's a question. I don't think I numbered them. It says, besides the individual stories in Genesis, how do you see the themes and trajectories laid out in this book developed in the rest of the Bible? In your view, how does Genesis play a foundational role for the entire Bible? Now, so this question presupposes that you're coming to it with whatever thoughts you've developed over the years in your Christian journey and your understanding of the Bible to this present time, because we haven't really dug that deeply into Genesis yet. So relying on your understanding of Genesis that you've accumulated over the years up to this point, what do you think? How like I read it from Morris that Genesis is a foundation to understand the Bible. I think it's clear that the not judo, the Judeo-Christian tradition, clearly has seen the Genesis account as an basic premise for understanding the Christian life and the with God life in general. In your view, how does Genesis play a foundational role for the entire Bible? And we could even phrase it more broadly than that. Like, do you think have you understood it to be so? And if not, why not? And in what ways?
I think if you understand it as, if you don't understand it completely, then you don't see the order in the rest of Scripture. Like, I think if you see Genesis as a very orderly chapter, a very orderly book, you see creation had order, you see the patriarchal history had order, you see everything in order, then to me it just gives us this confidence that God had order, he had plans for redemption.
Right.
He had this, so if we carry that theme through all the way to Revelation, you see this theme of order. And so we did hear it reiterated in, like Corinthians, it specifically spoke of order, like in worship, or, I don't know, I just think, to me, it's always to me, one of the most important parts of Genesis is just the God of order. He was not the God of chaos. He didn't just magically have all this stuff going in the air and then created mankind. Like, there was order.
But also the beginning, like, for example, that's why the words like Adam and Sarah is faith, because they didn't have enough background to have this armchair quarterbacking on Monday.
Right.
Where they can see the order, because when we get to Christ's time, we've seen a lot of order. And for me, that order that you talk about is the foundation of my faith, in knowing that what he said and what these prophets and are Paul and all those, they will come to fruition, because all of the evidence were orderly there and proved. There's a consistent proof that.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
But I
Oh,
would say,
absolutely.
A little bit of me struggles with
Yeah.
the fact that he created perfection.
Mhm.
And even when he created man and woman, it was perfection. And yet, in some way, he allowed the sin. I
Right.
mean, he had to know
For sure.
that they were going to do that. And
Yeah.
to me,
That's that's a super important topic. Go ahead if you have a thought on that.
Well, and the thing with them was him allowing that to happen was for us to properly be free beings, he would have had to allow something to happen if we were going to be how he wanted us to be. He wanted us to be free, he wanted us to know him with a deep understanding of his love and compassion. So if he didn't allow us to have sin and to fall into what our desires, we couldn't be how he wants us to be, we couldn't be free. It would be, otherwise it would be like a tyrannical person saying, love me, love me, love me.
Yeah. Well, so and that's absolutely true. And so here's a question. I'm going to rephrase your observation in the form of a few theological questions, trying to answer which I've lost countless hours of sleep. So here's a few questions. Why did God create man? And okay, so the obvious answer, or the one that gets perpetrated the most, you getting cold, Maisie? You look like Christina crossing your arms. So why? Well, because he loves man. He wants to have a relationship. Or like one author says, God made people because he wanted children. He wanted to be a father. It's like, okay, that I'd say, sure, that's definitely present in the reasons why God. So, okay, but if he did that, then why did God allow man to fall? And if God is all knowing and all powerful, he had to know it, like you just said. It's like, it's super obvious. The reformers spent a lot of time with this, like John Calvin, Knox, the Puritans dealt with this a lot. They really wanted to understand these ideas. And they dealt with, let's say, produced a body of theology in the 16 and 1700s, especially. There are a lot of congregational Puritans that I studied, that got men like John Flavel. and Richard Sibbs. So they dealt with this a lot. So okay, the reformers came up with these ideas. These mean nothing to you now, but I'm going to use the theological phrases and then explain them. Sublapsarianism, supralapsarianism, and lapsarianism. Whew, you're like, what the heck is that? I never heard a preacher say that on Sunday. That's because I have a hard enough time getting people to come to church on time, much less to listen to that nonsense. Okay, what does that mean? So when did God decide that Christ would come and die on the cross? Did he decide before the fall, during the fall, or after the fall? That's all those three words mean. So now I'm going to ask that question again with that little bit of that background and that a little bit of that information. Why did God create man? Okay, to be in relationship with them. Wait a second, but he created them with free will. There's no question. I don't like the phrase free will very much. I don't find it to be, I think people misuse that phrase a lot, but he did. We have a certain freedom of the will. Martin Luther famously wrote a book called The Bondage of the Will because he hated the term free will so much. So we have a certain freedom. As Jonathan Edwards said, we make free decisions within the boundaries of God's sovereign decree. Like he said, it is thus, and so it is, and within the boundaries of that, we make decisions. Okay. Why did God make man? Because he wanted a relationship with us. Okay. Because he wanted to have beings to reflect his glory. That's what worship is, to adore him. And he's not egotistical because he actually deserves the worship. Why did God create man? To glorify himself at the cross in Christ. Like that's what the reformer said. God made man in order that he might demonstrate his love, his grace, his character, his nature at the cross. So what happens? The cross of Christ becomes the pinnacle of human creation, not the goodness of the garden. However, because of the cross, we're going to have a restored garden. So now again, like if I want to make sense of the Bible, I got to read Genesis like it really happened, because then I can read Revelation 21 like it's really going to happen. Oh, wait a second. So Jesus comes back, the earth is restored. And what do you see in Revelation chapter 21 at the center of the New Jerusalem? The tree of life. So now all of a sudden, Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are all about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Where what? And even if we see, I think it's a real tree, but let's take it as a symbolic tree. Okay, fine. So man chose his own judgment over God's. God knew he was going to do it. So he always planned to send Christ. Then in Revelation 21, let's say that's a symbolic tree. Again, I don't think it is. I think there's a real tree with a real river, and those streets really going to have gold on them. Like that's what I think. Okay, but let's take it as a metaphorical tree. Because of the tree of death, of the cross, of suffering and shame, then we're going to really be eating from the tree of life. So, it makes, again, God, like one commentator says it this way. Genesis 1 through 11 affirms that you and I live in a personal universe. God made man because he really wanted to be in relationship. He created us a little lower than the angels with freedom of will. The angels do not function the same way we do. And then Genesis 12 through 50 emphasizes that we live in a purposeful universe. Same thing we've been talking about. So it's like, so my point in saying all this is hopefully to communicate something of value, but also to say, you're not the first one to ask that question. Like that has been it's a problem. Like that's a serious problem for the skeptic, for the atheist, for the unbeliever, for the one who just, what are you talking about? Like today, the biggest objections are not which denomination should I belong to. That ship sailed 200 years ago. Today, the biggest objection is you're trying to tell me in light of all this suffering and pain, that there's a God who loves me. You better make that make sense to me. Well, it only makes sense if we see the cross of Jesus Christ as a major purposeful event, and if we do it on the back of what Sebastian said and what you alluded to. Oh, okay. So he doesn't want automatons, puppets on a string. So God created man so that he could be an authentic relationship through his son, through the church, with each and every heart, so that we could know him in personal relationship. So why did God make man? Knowing he would fall, so that Christ could be glorified at the cross, so that he could, think about it. It's like Again, it's like we barely have 1% the capacity to even comprehend the mind of God, but it's like God fully expressed his nature at the cross. He's perfectly just. He couldn't ignore sin. He's perfectly holy. He couldn't ignore it. But he's so full of love and grace and mercy that he made a way even through the most horrible thing that imaginable. The only perfect man ever, he's going to die for imperfect beings. And then it's like, wow, that's what a mind-blowing idea that the God who created all of this did it with so much purpose that he would do that for me by name. Yeah.
Answered.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, it makes sense, because if we were puppets, it would always be perfect, but.
What the Bible says, without faith, it's impossible to please God.
Well, you know,
And how do you solicit faith if you don't have to make decisions?
Is that you were looking at your children as children, and you were protecting them from running out on the walking or whatever it is. But now your relationship as an adult, at least with mine, is I can sit back and we can have a drink together or a beer. We can talk together, and I've had my son so many times say, I only knew what I did to you, Dad, as a kid. And now that I'm a parent myself, I understand. And so my relationship with my son is evolved into a different plane. And your daughter or your son is what is that? Because, and that's the plane that God wants to build a relationship with us. He wants to be able to kick back, enjoy himself, and enjoy the room with all of his children. Admiring him, but also loving him and just having a nice conversation. Yeah, exactly. There is and if you take that analogy, and that analogy is present in the Bible from the start to the finish. Right, it's always, we're going to talk about it Sunday, our Father. Okay, so that analogy is present. The family of God is present, and it's like one of the ways to understand the Bible, and this is, I think, a chief way. This is key to understanding the Bible. Is that exact analogy. If you imagine humanity as a newborn baby, the Garden of Eden, and then the toddler stage out of Eden, and then the adolescent stage, you could probably call that something like the patriarchal phase, right? Where Israel just doesn't, as soon as they get it, they rebel. And then you come into the New Testament, now you're receiving more of the fullness of the earliness of adulthood, but now the church has to go through many trials to be purified, to become mature. And what does the Bible say? To become a bride purified, ready for the wedding feast of the Lamb. So it's like when you say, well, okay, like in the Old Testament, well, why did God say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Well, that was a lot better than what was happening in those early barbaric days, because it wasn't an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That sounds like barbarism to us, but to the ancients, that was, if he offends you, you don't go kill his wife and all his kids and burn his goats and burn his whole village, right? It's like, no, justice. That's what eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is. It's justice. And order. It's like you can't just go burn down the whole village, you know. And you have to tell that to the toddler who gets mad because his sibling took his chicken nugget, and next thing you know, he's got a metal cup upside his head, you know. But so yeah.
Well, I think it's so important for evangelism too. Like, I think as Christians, if we really understand Genesis, it helps us in evangelism, because that, like you said, this searching, when people are searching for the God that created them, most of the times they come to it with their hurt and their pain, and they're like, but you're telling me about this loving God who created you, and he created X, Y, Z as well. And so to me, like, when we can really wrap our minds around Genesis, like, to me, it helps with evangelism, because it's like, you can explain the very nature of who God is. By the power that he demonstrated.
Yeah, and you can see the lack of order and the chaos that's come into the modern era by having tried to rip this out as a foundational understanding. I mean, my favorite psychologist ever is a guy named Jordan Peterson, who explains the psychology of Western civilization as it developed from a biblical worldview. And I'm not even sure he's a believer exactly, but he's something like wrestling with belief, you know? And you can see, like Friedrich Nietzsche famously is quoted how he said, God is dead and we killed him. Nietzsche wasn't this famous philosopher from the turn of the 20th century. He wasn't happy about it. And I learned this from listening to Jordan Peterson. I started reading some of Nietzsche at his advice. He wasn't happy about it. What Nietzsche was saying is, we're taking out the foundation of our civilization and it's going to collapse. And these ideas that you can fill it with something new are foolish. God is dead and we killed him, and it's not a good thing. But nobody ever quotes the rest of what Nietzsche said. Because the modernist and postmodernist says, well, if I can get rid of this nonsense, if I can get rid of this, then I can be free. The real irony is that the more of this you pull away, the less free men become. You know, this was
Socialism, communism.
right, and so it's not just on a personal level or like a little community level. It's a big deal.
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work. And so when we look at this, yeah, there's purpose in Genesis. There's purpose in our lives. There's purpose in the Bible. Here's a question I have for you. This is we're right at the end of our time. Does anyone have? We'll get into the genealogy thing, which is question number 2 another week. But what perplexes you about Genesis? Is there anything that really perplexes you about Genesis? I'm glad they put this in here as a question, because if there is, or if it comes up later, if you tell me, I'll do my best to do some research on anything and try to, flesh it out. Is there anything in particular that perplexes you about Genesis? What questions do you hope to see answered by a study of Genesis? Is there anything?
I think you could have left out the begats.
That's right. Oh, that's funny you say that, because I just glossed over the second question, which is why are all these genealogies in Genesis?
Yeah,
So we'll do that. We'll deal with the genealogies
I like to understand
a little
the
bit.
loss of dominion.
Yeah,
You've indicated that all of this was passed on orally to Moses. Is there any evidence that there were previous written accounts?
that's a good question. I'll dig into that a bit, Bruce. That's a good question. For sure, I'll dig into that.
Well, something to think about that with the oral accounts is that even into the early church, that's how things were made for about 500 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's
why,
right.
I mean, and even if you go into say, you go into an Orthodox church, there's icons painted all over. That was the way that people translated things, the way they taught stories that we could read.
That's
Even
right.
after they got it.
Yeah, I'll dig into that a little bit more. Some of that is probably part of the answer to that, because for sure, and also ancient peoples, like we see it in Haiti, and it's crazy how a non-literate society, which there are people who read in Haiti, but it's like, they say it's like 70% literacy rating, but even many of those who are literate, they're not readers really. They're like, that means they can read the instructions on how to do something. Like, they're not readers because there's not even that many books available. And in some of the rural areas, I think the average literacy rate is much lower than that. I also think that maybe just an optimistic, statistic put out by the people responsible for making people literate. But anyway, you see in a non-literate society or nominally literate society like Haiti, people have the best memories, like the next level memories that I can't possibly compete with. So the ancients were that way. So I'll look into that, Bruce. I'll look into that specifically. I find that an interesting
That's
question
the reason
too.
why I keep telling you about the Bible being, and where Jesus in that period of time became there, because of the fact that we had written languages.
Yeah.
Greek, the Bible's written in Greek, it's written in Aramaic.
Yeah, there's some Aramaic in it.
And Hebrew, right?
Yep, and Hebrew.
Maybe three.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, okay, they actually, they had the Torah, they had things written.
Yeah.
So, but that was the earliest period of time that God could actually start to reveal himself.
That's right.
And then we're still going, we're 2,000 years ahead of that, but we're
Right.
still going back 2,000 years to those exact written
Oh,
words.
absolutely.
Do you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Those were two, but that was the beginning.
Yep, absolutely.
That was the beginning, so. anyway.
Like in Romans,
Absolutely.
talking about proclaiming the gospel, the commentaries always say it's proclaiming it spoken, it's speaking the words of the gospel. So we see that the importance of that oral tradition.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. That's
Paul
right.
said this in Romans, do as I taught you, in word and traditions I taught you.
That's right. Yep, the church, the church. Yeah, think about even the culture of a church, even like a local church like ours. You don't probably it would take a minute to unpack them, but there's unwritten rules in churches. There's unwritten rules in
Like I
families.
sit in the same row.
Yeah, like I sit in the same row, like there's, I've been in churches where it was like, where people got corrected, visitors, and it's like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Just try to encourage them to not sit in your pew. Well, hey, thanks everybody for coming. And yep, we'll look forward to seeing y'all next week.
Okay, thank you.
I'll stop this recording and I'll make sure that I'm just gonna make a page on the website to start putting these kinds of things on. I'll let everybody know it's there. I'll let Cindy know too.
We.
So God bless you guys.